Hi, so thank you so much for being here. Could you do me a favor and just briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Erin Buzuvis. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a professor and the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at Western New England University School of Law in Springfield, Massachusetts.
Thank you. So, you have been writing about Title IX in the context of athletics for almost 2 decades. So, a substantial portion of your academic career. I'm really interested to know more about where your interest in this topic originates and how your scholarship has evolved over time.
Yeah, well, I mean, honestly, when I was just a wee baby law professor looking to get started and make a name for myself in some area of law, I thought about what interested me generally. And I have to say, I was a law student who totally geeked out in administrative law. I really wanted to dig into something that was regulated. And I also had very strong interests in gender equality. So putting those two things together, really led me to Title IX. At that time, there was a controversial regulatory clarification that had been issued that allowed college athletic departments to use interest surveys to cap the maximum number of women's athletic opportunities they would be obligated to offer. And there were so many things fundamentally wrong with that regulatory interpretation that it was a natural fit for me to write about. And I have just been writing about Title IX related issues ever since.
Great. And I'm curious, and maybe it's just the logical progression of where our culture has gone, but what precipitated your exploration of the particular discrimination faced by trans athletes under, our existing federal regulatory and state and local statutory schemes?
Yeah, I mean, that was also a natural fit for somebody interested in writing about Title IX at that time. In the early 2000s, 2010, plus or minus a few years, courts were really starting to get their heads around the application of sex discrimination statutory provisions to LGBTQ rights, generally speaking. And exploring the relationship between sex, which is what the statutory provision says, and other things that are connected to or viewed in relation to sex, such as gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. And so there had been a number of employment discrimination cases, hiring cases, but also more interesting to me from an athletic standpoint, bathroom cases and dorm cases, because like athletics, those are also spaces that are segregated on the basis of sex. And then even in the Title IX context, there was one short-lived district court level opinion challenging exclusion of someone from a sports team under Title IX because of their sexual orientation, because the players involved were lesbians. And so we're starting to see at that time courts really digging into, I think, a compelling, intellectually challenging question about how we talk about sex when we are considering its application beyond the sort of early era, more straightforward applications of sex discrimination laws in general. So it really was a natural fit for somebody writing about Title IX and interested in those cases to think about how, for example, bathroom access cases could translate into the context of athletics, or how a case about lesbian basketball players could translate into the context of trans girls playing girls sports.
That makes perfect sense. So I'd like to just start by getting your thoughts on the value of discussing trans athlete inclusion in scholastic sports separately from trans inclusion in elite sports, which is not to say that trans athletes should not be included in elite sports, but I do think that these are two separate but related conversations, but I'd like to kind of get your thoughts on that.
Right. And I appreciate the opportunity to contextualize this conversation around this intentional choice to elevate sports in the education setting. which I think need to have the absolute highest priority as a civil rights matter and as a civil rights crisis that is ongoing. So I think, I'm someone who accepts the reason for including athletics in our curriculum, in our K through 12 education programs. We have decided as a nation, and we're a bit unique actually in this regard, that schools are a place where athletic access happens. We fund this with our taxpayer dollars. We have an expectation that students who go to school have opportunities for extracurricular enrichment through athletics. And we do that maybe, without contemplating the reasons why. But when you do contemplate the reasons why, I think there's a very compelling connection there. Sports assist students in the maturation process. They learn how to respond to instructions, how to receive feedback and coaching. They learn how to get along well with others, all kinds of leadership and character education, all kinds of physical education. You can learn through your experience with scholastic sport how to have a lifelong relationship with fitness, with exercise, with all kinds of healthy physical habits. The socioeconomic or socio-emotional benefits are overwhelming and compelling. And so all these things help students create the right kind of mentality and framework and interest in and commitment to their curricular education, as well as providing an education in their own right. So when you accept that athletics is not just some second tier, not so important, afterthought component of what it is that our public schools are about and the education that they're delivering, but they actually play an integral role, we realize that they too have to be, that there's as compelling a reason for making sure that there isn't discrimination excluding people from athletics as we are concerned about discrimination excluding people from the classroom. In other contexts, in the elite athletic context, there are important reasons for elite athletics to be inclusive. You can look to that as a mirror. You can look to that for role models. But that expectation of participation, that factor does not weigh as strongly in the elite athletic context. In fact, it's called elite for a reason, because the vast majority of people are already excluded. So in contrast, to me, it just matters so much more to focus attention and energy and conversation on the scholastic context, because participation is an expectation, because participation has a value that's linked to another fundamentally important context, education, that we have decided already civil rights should apply.
Absolutely. So in your scholarship, and in specifically your 2016 article on this topic, you highlight the particular social and psychological harm that young trans athletes specifically experience when participation policies, whether those are birth certificate policies or hormone policies, are imposed upon them as a prerequisite to inclusion in scholastic sports. So how would you respond to scholars and advocates who have argued that basing policy on trans athlete inclusion, due to the experience of pain and harm, both, to the individuals who are actually excluded and the trans community more broadly, that's problematic from a legal standpoint because it is too subjective, both in determining the intensity of the harm or the pain, and in categorizing or prioritizing the pain that might be experienced, for example, by cisgender athletes who maybe feel that they've lost opportunities or that they have lost privacy or whatever particular harm they might assert. due to the inclusion of trans athletes?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question, and I certainly don't want to undermine the case for inclusion inadvertently by talking about its importance and the reasons why it matters and should be taken seriously. And I should say, before I answer your question directly, maybe it helps to say just a bit about what that harm is, right? So the harm of being excluded from athletics for a trans athlete. First of all, you've got the same kinds of harms that you could imagine when any student would be excluded from athletics. So the lost opportunity to engage in all of those enriching activities that I mentioned earlier. But in addition to that, particular for transgender athletes, there is the harm of having your gender identity rejected and denied by important key players in your life. Other than your family's acceptance by your school community is the most important venue for affirmation to take place. And when that affirmation is withheld, it is seriously damaging from a social and psychological aspect. It is, social science has demonstrated that the biggest risk for trans youth in terms of mental health issues, in terms of increased risk of things as a variety of harms, but going up to and including the risk of suicidality is the withholding of affirmation and acceptance of one's gender identity. So just to be clear about what harms I'm talking about that you're referencing in that from that article, that's what we're talking about. It's literally a matter of life and death. So why do I point that out? I'm not trying to advance an argument that there has to be some kind of certain harm threshold before we take something seriously as a civil rights issue. That's not at all the reason why I point that out, and I hope that doesn't ever creep into a misinterpretation of my work. But rather, I'm pointing this out to really underscore how trans participation in scholastic athletics belongs within the mix of civil rights issues that we have already decided to take seriously. We take education seriously as a civil right because exclusion causes both individual and societal harm for the people who are excluded. If education's role in society is to prepare people for social and civic responsibility, and if you're boxed out of that opportunity by virtue of discrimination, you are marginalized in ways that we as a society have deemed inappropriate, and we've passed civil rights laws to address that. Lest people not take sports as seriously as an aspect of civil rights in the education context, I try to lay this foundation when I get the chance to speak or write about trans rights in scholastic sports. Just as it's possible for people to not take sports seriously, there's also a tendency among certain segments of the population to dismiss trans identities as not worthy of the same kind of protection that civil rights laws provide to other identities. So when I argue that excluding a trans kid from middle or high school sports increases the risk of serious harm, that it's a life and death issue potentially, I'm also underscoring that trans identity is, like other civil rights categories, sex, race, disability, etc., something intrinsic, something important, something immutable. And for all of these categories, you don't have the option to avoid the harm caused by discrimination by changing or ignoring that aspect of yourself. So I'm not trying to single out the harm to trans kids and saying this is a threshold we need to meet in order for civil rights law to apply. I'm really just trying to make the case that this fits in and is an extremely compelling example of the things that we already use civil rights laws for.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me. I mean, obviously, when the Department of Education was, created as an executive department in 1979, part of its explicit purpose was to advance the ability of marginalized groups to access education. And while trans people were not necessarily being discussed, in those spaces at the time, it is clearly within the mandate of the DOE to protect and elevate educational opportunities for marginalized groups, including trans people. So the DOE has proposed these changes to the Title IX rules, which is really the first formal move, I would say, to prohibit or protect against discrimination trans people under Title IX. There have been, interpretive letters and other types of agency action, but nothing quite as formal as this proposed rule change. But this is coming at a time when the broader cultural landscape includes aggressively anti-trans state legislation being enacted and even federal legislation being proposed in response to the rulemaking that is anti-trans. So as I spend time with the notice of proposed rulemaking, the DOE fact sheets on the proposed changes, I am struck by this focus on preserving fairness in competition. Mm-hmm. If you read between the lines, or, maybe not even reading between the lines, this is about protecting fairness or preserving fairness for cis female athletes. And I recognize that the implementation of Title IX was motivated by a desire to improve opportunities for and treatment of women and girls in educational environments. We certainly have not achieved equity in many aspects of education, particularly athletics. But as you point out in the article I referenced earlier, expanding opportunities for trans athletes is part of eradicating or addressing sex discrimination. Protection of trans athletes seems like a logical extension of our continued pursuit of gender equality. Yet the debate seems to be the exact opposite, that by advancing the rights of trans athletes, we are attacking the rights of female athletes, cis female athletes. So, was there like a moment or a point where you can identify where the conversation and the debate about gender and sex-based classification in athletics escalated to this point of, what I kind of think of as this clash of traditional feminist ideology with, more progressive approaches to trans inclusion?
A moment or time that can be, like a demarcation between before and after. I mean, I would say to some extent, no, because there has always been some feminist basis for objecting to trans women included in women's sports since Renee Richards sued the U.S. Open in 1977, and successfully, and was able to compete on the women's tour after that. So I don't want to risk oversimplifying this history here and saying that we were all on one side of this issue until the early 2020s, when issues politically started to change. So there has always been that ideological conflict. That said, there is a noticeably different scale and magnitude in this conversation since the Trump administration and some things that were going on there. In particular, how the Trump administration was applying Title IX against the Athletic Association in Connecticut, which has a very inclusive policy, allows trans girls to compete on the basis of their gender identity being bona fide female, without requiring any kind of particular physical or medical transition milestones. And by the way, many states up until the sort of recent backlash have had inclusive policies. At one point, the majority of states permitted trans athletes to compete. Some of them used a hormone requirement, similar to the NCAA's former policy of having 1 year of hormone treatment. But there were many states, at least a dozen states, that had policies like Connecticut's, Massachusetts, California, that permitted gender identity-based participation without any restrictions. So one of those states is Connecticut, and in Connecticut, we happen to see two highly successful trans girl athletes competing in track and field at around the same time. And so even though these inclusive statewide policies go back to the first one promulgated in 2006, right? So plenty of trans kids have had the opportunity to compete for many years in a variety, almost all, or a majority of states, and going back in some states as far as 2006. At some point, you're going to get some who are really good, and notwithstanding the fact that they're also happen to be trans. They happen to be both good athletes and trans. Those two things came together for two particular athletes in a small state. And because that was an era of political opposition to trans rights and an administration that could use its opposition to trans rights to garner political support from its base, we saw Title IX attempted to be applied to squash Connecticut's inclusive policy. So because that was so high profile, because that was so political, I think it really amplified the conversation in this regard. I think it's not, and to bring it back to the clash between different versions of feminist ideology, that is also around the same time when we started to see much more formally that division playing out in the public sphere. So the Women's Sports Policy Working Group, for example, organized and started publishing under that name its objections to categorically inclusive policies like Connecticut's. So I think that is a milestone in terms of the political conversation, but this issue itself and this conflict isn't necessarily new.
Right. Absolutely. I do find it interesting that the proposed federal legislation does have language that explicitly articulates a need to protect women in sports from a loss of opportunity, which seems consistent with a lot of the viewpoints of some of those groups that you mentioned. So what are your thoughts on how the proposed rule changes, if they became final, would actually affect school policies? And I realize it's very difficult to generalize because, as you said, there has been for many, many years quite a wide variety of policies, depending on the state, with regard to trans athlete inclusion. But, does requiring sex-based inclusion policies to be substantially related to an important educational objective while also minimizing harms to students barred from participating in sports consistent with their gender identity represent a step forward for trans youth? Or is it, not enough? And, what do you think will happen in the further future if there is an administration change where things become less progressive at the executive level?
Yeah, that's such a rich question and has a lot of gives us a lot of things to potentially discuss. So one thing I'll mention, as I did in response to your first answer, is remind you that I'm an administrative law geek. I actually am living my law school dream and teaching administrative law for a living. And so because I'm oriented in that space generally about how administrative agencies make policy, that process is important. I feel like I can separate my viewpoint on process from substance, right? So I'll try to address both in my answer to your question. Substantively, I have not backed down. I continue to endorse what I wrote in 2016, which is that I believe state athletic associations should be promulgating policies that maximize inclusion, that let kids play sports on the basis of their affirmed gender identity without adding any extra legal or paperwork or medical restrictions. So I'm all for maximizing inclusion. As a matter of process, in terms of how we get there, we have to think about how administrative agencies work. The fact that they have a variety of tools to create policy, the fact that they are connected to the political system, and often have to take a pragmatic approach that lets them live to fight another day. And I think that might be a bit of what's going on here, and why that regulatory provision, coming out of an administration that is saying in general all the right things about the importance of trans inclusion and trans civil rights in a variety of contexts, has introduced, as you say, the possibility of considering this issue from the standpoint of fairness, which is code for the possibility of excluding people if it's not fair for the cisgender girls who they're competing against. So, I think that when a regulation is promulgated and it has built-in gray area, it is also setting up the agency to clarify that gray area over time through enforcement action over time, kind of a common law approach, if you will, equivalent to addressing issues that are not specifically stated or a standard that isn't specifically stated. So I think over time, the agency is setting itself up to define what it means to have an exclusion that's related to an important educational objective, that it's setting itself up over time to figuring out what minimizing harm means, and that it can do that in a way that takes into account potentially a more pragmatic incrementalist approach, in a way that allows it to not draw the ire of political opponents who could potentially pass a statute that completely supersedes Title IX's application to this area. So it's possible that what DOE is doing is trying to use all the tools in its arsenal, right? As opposed to just trying to get everything done through this one this one rulemaking process. Now, your question also asked about what is this going to, how is this going to affect school policies? I think the reason why this incremental approach is worth considering and seeing the upside of it is that right off the bat, we have 22 states who have since 2020 passed categorical bans on trans girls' inclusion in girls' sports. And the regulation does make clear that in no world is a categorical ban going to pass muster under this new regulatory provision. So 22 states that have taken this extreme action will need to be, have some kind of reconciliation over that fact. And I think that is a huge counteroffensive that is being set up by this regulation. And it might be worth, not going for a regulation that mandates inclusion on all fronts for everyone, the rule I, in my heart of hearts would like, if it means being able to, in the short term, address this very serious trend in state legislation. Now, their enforcement will be tricky for sure, because what is Title IX but a civil rights law under the cloak of spending clause legislation, right? So Title IX says you can't discriminate if you take federal funding. And so the choice that any institution that wants to step outside of Title IX and do their own thing is to say, I am just not going to accept federal funding, right? This is the approach that Grove City College pioneered when it said it did not want to conform to Title IX's requirements with respect to sex discrimination, and proudly asserts on its website that students who apply better not be expecting federal financial aid because they have opted out of that federal program so that it can make its own decisions without influence of federal civil rights laws. So a state like Idaho that has a law that categorically bans trans girls from competing, schools in that state are going to have to make a choice. Either we comply with Title IX and compete and continue to accept federal funding, or we defy our state law. Well, defying state law might not be a choice if the state decides to aggressively enforce it, in which case Title IX says to Idaho schools, bye-bye, right? No federal funding for you. You can go ahead and be discriminatory, but not with the federal taxpayers' dollars. That is a really extreme remedy that Title IX contemplates, and it has never before been deployed. It is, in some minds, I've called it in other contexts, a weapon that's too big to use, because the consequences for that are bad for the school children of Idaho and any other state, right? That now does not have access to federal subsidies for school lunch, right? I mean, what kind of heartless government takes food out of the mouths of children, right? So that's going to be a pretty tricky enforcement. Like the optics of that enforcement process are going to be tricky to navigate. But what could potentially happen if this rule passes, that it gives ammunition to those in the state legislatures that oppose these bans in the first place to say, we cannot engage in a game of chicken with the federal government with our children's education on the line. All we have to do is change this law and then then see what happens, see how this works out. Maybe some more minimal restrictions will be upheld, and we'll have to live with that. But the best case scenario would be that in response to this regulation, that state laws decide to change themselves to become compliant with Title IX. If they don't and enforcement takes place, this will be a historic application of Title IX to see it all the way through to the point of potentially withdrawing federal funds from schools that are forced by virtue of state law to have a policy that conflicts with Title IX.
Would you anticipate there'd be federal legislation to prevent that sort of nuclear option from being exercised?
I mean, it's a possibility. You can always override regulatory choices with statutory ones. But the other thing we know if we study process is that the legislative process is also by design very cumbersome and slow and has lots of opportunities for filibuster and all kinds of maneuvers. It's something that could certainly be attempted. Whether or not it succeeds, I think any legislation is a long shot to succeed. So this would we would have to factor that in as well in terms of predicting whether a legislative outcome could take place. It certainly could. But
I did find it ominous that this most recent piece of legislation actually made it through the House. I did. I was surprised, honestly. Yeah. I don't know why, but I was surprised.
Yeah, it is disappointing that it got that far. But we have bicameralism and presentment for a reason. The legislative process is deliberately meant to weed out a lot of things that get started, but then don't get to complete the legislative process.
So I did just want to finish up though with a thought, well, with your thoughts on sort of the more individual procedural challenges of Title IX enforcement, which is if the proposed rules become final and school policies change and schools create what they believe are legitimate policies, in that, perhaps they assert fairness as the educational purpose, for trans exclusion, not a blanket ban on trans exclusion. Let's say, trans exclusion at in particular grades or on a particular type of team, like a varsity team. My concern is that a student will have to come along in that district affected by that policy and challenge it. And they and their families, probably because we're talking about children, right, who probably are not going and finding their own legal representation and, making administrative challenges themselves, have to incur the time, the financial burden, and take the risk of exposing themselves and putting themselves in opposition to their school and their community in order to hash out the legitimacy of a school policy. It strikes me as being a battle that very few individuals will be willing to fight, which is why, to me, it still feels like not even close to enough.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly, that one of the most compelling reasons for inclusive policies that don't mess around with potentially challengeable exceptions is that if you really want people to participate, and when we're talking about scholastic sports, that should be the goal, to maximize participation, that anything that could deter someone, either because they think they're going to get challenged if they show up, even if they think that they are compliant with the law or with the policy, but that somebody's going to make us think about it, or there's some gray area and they're not sure. Anything that could deter participation. There are so many choices that kids can make for how to spend their time, some more healthy than others, right? And that if you're putting up barriers to participation or perceived barriers, that those kinds of policies will have a chilling effect on participation, even above and beyond whoever is actually literally excluded by that policy. So that is absolutely a downside to the approach that's being taken here. I can say what that means for us as advocates is to try to. I mean, it's why I write in the space. I try to use the resources and the position that I have as an act of allyship so that the burden isn't on some of the most vulnerable people in our population, trans kids, to have to advocate for themselves. So whether it's within academia or within advocacy organizations, nonprofits, it's something we can all be mindful of when we're deciding where to donate our money as well as our time. That kind of organizing that that advocacy groups can do to put together potentially a group of aggrieved complainants or potentially plaintiffs if this plays out in litigation, makes the burden easier to bear, right? If you're part of a class, if you're part of a group, or to advocate on behalf of somebody. If you're challenging within the Title IX context, you don't need to have standing. Anyone can challenge. So you could be a bystander with skin in the game and seek to engage the enforcement authority of the Department of Education. And so there are opportunities for others to support and to take on some of that burden And I think that the point that you raise is just, I can't deny it, but I can use it to try to raise awareness about that and our collective responsibility to stand up and engage in this area.
Thank you. That's, I think, a great place to end. So thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise. I do kind of think of you as like the goat of this issue.
Oh my gosh. Thank you.
So to have you invest your time in this project is really means a lot to me. So thank you so much.
Well, it's my honor to be included. Thank you.